Hi, I'm Istvan Marko. I'm professor at the University Catholique de Louvain in Belgium. And I was actually involved with climate science when I started giving lectures on the chemistry of environment. And this led me to start to wonder about what actually people were talking about and what really were the facts about climate science. Now in here you can see a graph showing the temperature versus the time, and you can see that about 13,000 years ago we started to come out of a glacial period, and during that period there was a particular increase in temperature, quite strange, then a little cooling down significantly here called the Young Dryas cooling, and then we came out of that until we reached the optimum period that we are now, which is called the Holocene period, where man started to settle. What you can see is that there was a huge jump in temperature up to the modern period, and then at that time the temperature oscillated, but the overall trend is a downward trend in the temperature of our planet. What is quite sure is that sooner or later, maybe in 1,000 years, maybe more, nobody knows, we are going to go back into a glacial time, so into a period of really cold time. Now, if we look back in time, well, you can see that the temperatures were actually quite high compared to our modern period, for which there are so much alarmism going on. To take an example, the Roman optimum period, this is a drawing showing you Hannibal crossing the Alps with his elephant. He was able to do so at that time simply because he didn't encounter any ice or any snow. Nowadays, if you want to do that, you would be hard-pressed to succeed for the simple reason that the Alps actually contain enough snow and will block you to go over them, in contrast to what Hannibal did. The fact that he was able to do that at that period indicates that at that time, the temperature was actually higher than the one that we have encountered nowadays. Another period which was a nice and warm period was the so-called medieval warm period. This brought a lot of prosperity to European countries. This is also the period where the Vikings moved to Greenland and settled in Greenland, and they could grow crops, and they had sheep and cows and everything. And then as the time went by, then the temperature again went lower and lower, and we entered a rather dark age called the Little Ice Age period at which the temperatures fluctuated but were usually colder than nowadays. They were so cold at some times that the Seine River and the others were actually frozen on quite a large thickness. Market was being held even on the Thames at that time, and glacier advanced significantly. They get very close to certain places, like in that picture, when the Alpe Glacier was going to engulf this little church shown over there. Nowadays, the temperature is going up again, but it's not at all as high as it used to be in that optimum period, for the simple reason that we are discovering regularly remains of the settlements of the Vikings, and I cannot believe the Vikings dig their houses under the snow or the ice cover. So that means that it was much warmer at that time before the period where actually cold times settled in again. Now, this was recognized at the early time by the IPCC. Huber-Lamb, who was the first director at that time of the unit at the University of East Anglia, drew exactly the same map, and he showed that the modern time where we are here, the temperatures are actually lower than during the medieval warm period. This was a big problem because you cannot get money, you cannot get finance, you cannot scare people if you are trying to let them know that this is an abnormally high temperature as compared to what was before. And therefore, people among the climatology community have started to worry about this, and one of the conclusions they came up is that they had to get rid of the medieval warm period. This was done by Michael Mann, who produced the hockey stick, the infamous hockey stick, and that was actually shown as being completely erroneous at the time. So people are starting to scare other people in order to continue having funding or in order to continue pushing for certain agenda. Now, what are we talking about when we discuss about temperature of the Earth. We are talking, in fact, about temperature anomaly. And the graphs that people usually display looks like this one, in which you can see a gradual increase in temperature up to our modern period. Now, if you compare the temperature in 1880 to the temperature in 2016, the difference is about 0.7 degrees over a period of 134-35 years. That means a whopping 0.005 degree increase per year, which is really, really scary. I'm making a joke here. Now, thinking about it, on the same day, at the same moment in our planet, if you're in the middle of the desert, temperature can average up to plus 60 degrees. At the same time, in Antarctica, the temperature can be as low as minus 80 degrees. That means on our planet, even in the same day, temperature can be different by 140 degrees. And yet, life continues, and we are being scared by a 0.7 degree increase. This is completely ludicrous. Now, let's get a little bit closer to what we see. You can see here in orange the changes in temperature during the year, and these have been done since 1880, for example. That's the summer change in temperature. The same recording for the temperature in the winter is shown in green. When you do the subtraction of these two temperatures to measure the anomaly, you get, in fact, the red line, which is shown in here between these two arrows. That red line is the increase in temperature since 1880 to nowadays. You can see how immense and frightening this increase in temperature has been. If I show it to you like this, and notice that the scale is in degrees centigrade, from 0 to 10 and so on, these are real temperature degrees. If I show it like this, of course, nobody will worry about that so-called temperature increase. However, if I really want to scare you, all I have to do is change the scale. Rather than using a scale in degrees centigrade, I just increase the scale and use by 10th of a degree centigrade. And what looks like essentially background noise becomes something like an increase in temperature, scaring politicians and people who actually do not know about science at all. Now, the worst thing is this one. When you look at temperature, people actually do averaging of temperatures. And there are many ways since the previous years when people have actually measured this and done average temperatures, mean temperature calculations in very different ways. The classic one was to take the minimum maximum temperature and divide by 2. But there are much more sophisticated algorithms that allow you to give a mean temperature. None, of course, of them are equal to each other. And yet people have done a mix of all those data. But this is nothing compared to a very fundamental physics law, which always annoyed me, is the fact that temperature is an intensive variable. Intensive variable means you cannot average a variable like that. Yet, the very first thing that climate people do is to take a mean temperature. That means they average a temperature and they average it over and over again, and they subtract the average of a temperature over a 30-year period. So that means now that what they have is no longer a temperature. You cannot average a temperature. So the anomaly of temperature which is shown is a variable. I have nothing against using a variable, whatever it is. However, it has absolutely no physical relationship to temperature. You cannot say that because the anomaly increases, the temperature increases. You cannot, because that has no direct relationship to it. Furthermore, when people measure temperatures, you can see, for example, here that there are a number of holes in there. Nothing in the north, essentially nothing in the south of our planet. Every white place means that there is no temperature measured in there. So the average coming from the United Kingdom values actually have big lags in there, and yet they give you a change in temperature. The American do differently. The American actually use temperatures averaging and infilling, which means that the places where they have no measuring stations, they will actually consider that within a radius of 1,200 kilometers, the temperature is the same. For someone like me living in Europe, that means that the temperature of the north of Finland and the south of Spain is the same. And that is absolutely ludicrous, obviously. The way temperatures are measured by using Stephenson stations, for example, is also very doubtful. There was a nice study by Anthony Watts who showed that a large number, well over 90% of the American weather station measuring devices were actually flawed, and they were flawed for numerous reasons. Here is one which is working perfectly. It's located in an empty space where it should be located, and you can see that essentially temperature has not varied much over the time period which is investigated. Here is another one which is suffering from a number of debilitating problems. For example, it's close to the exhaust of an air conditioning unit. In the meantime, asphalt has been built, towers have been erected, and you can see that overall the transformation led to an increase in temperature. This has nothing to do, obviously, with our participation to any kind of global temperature increase. It just gives you so many errors inbuilt in the generation of these data that they can really not be trusted properly. People also tell you that the increase in temperature we're observing nowadays is absolutely abnormal and particularly critical. Well, these are data coming from Phil Jones from the UK, and Phil Jones showed that even in the 1860, for example, the temperature rose by 0.16 degrees. You can see that later, from 1910 to 1950, the temperature rose exactly with the same value. What is interesting is that the slope of these red arrows are always the same. This is the abnormal temperature increase that we observe nowadays. And you can see an alternating between increasing, decreasing, increasing, decreasing. So what we are observing nowadays has nothing abnormal into it. It has nothing to do with the production of CO2 by human beings, and we don't have to worry about our imprint in there. Here is another way to show this. In blue, you can see the variation of temperature, an increase up to 1930 or so, a decrease up to the 1960, 1970, and then again an increase in temperature. Notice that carbon dioxide, which is this green line, is increasing in a gradual, monotonous way. And while the temperature went up in here, CO2 increased slightly. However, while it went down here quite significantly, CO2 kept increasing at the same monotonous rate. That means that there is no correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide. If there is no correlation, that's a simple rule, there can be no causality whatsoever. What is worse is when we look at that period in here. During about 20 years, the two curves seem to correlate with each other. And now, as soon as we reach 1998, the curve breaks down again. Because since that period, for over 18 years, the temperatures have been flat or even slightly decreasing. During that time, CO2 has continued to increase at the same rate. So again, that means that there is utterly no correlation between the two. What is worse is while the temperatures have not increased during this 30 years period, the amount of CO2 we have released amount to about 1/3 of all the CO2 released by man since the industrial period. This is not only true for a few years, this is also true for a more longer period. This is work done by Ole Umlum. You can see in blue the increase in temperature. And as you can immediately visualize, while the temperature of the planet increases in blue, CO2 in green increases with a delay. And that lag is about 8 to 11 months. So on a yearly, multi-yearly, decadal basis, temperature increases and then CO2 is produced. A consequence can obviously not be a cause of a phenomenon. Even on a secular basis and millennium basis, these are temperature data in black and CO2 data measured from ice cores drilling in different stations, for example, Sipple station. And you can see here in black the increase in temperature, and then in red the CO2 increase that followed with an 800 to 1,000 year delay. So clearly, and despite what Al Gore has said before, CO2 is a consequence of temperature increase and not a cause for temperature increase. More interesting is this work by Murray Salby. You can see that the curve from 1990 to 2000 of the increase in fossil fuel emission of CO2 emission went up in a steady state, and then since about 2000, the slope increased quite dramatically. Well, the amount of CO2 equals to the integral under that particular slope. If you remove the amount, the blue colored integral from there, you have this pinkish color here, and what is left, what is overproduced from 2000 to 2013 is the red colored area. And that amounts to an increase of more than 200% of carbon dioxide. However, if you look at the overall CO2, this is man-made CO2, if you look at the changes in the overall CO2 of our planet, as measured, for example, in Mauna Loa, you see that during the first period, in blue in here, you can get the integral that goes slightly, this is the slope. During the second period, where the human production increased significantly, the slope actually didn't change whatsoever. If the slope change was so minuscule, that means that human participation in CO2 release is actually extremely small. So small, it's actually immeasurable. Now, these are curves and graphs that are actually being shown and coming from calculations by the models. Climate modeling people like to do that, and they can produce all kinds of curves like this. This is what we call the spaghetti dish, because every single model, every iteration will give you a different endpoint of these values. This is because climate has a chaotic component, and they cannot actually get twice the same result. What is more interesting is that in blue and in green, you can see the real measured temperatures as done by satellite and by weather balloons. The average value of the models is shown as the black thick line which is displayed there. What you can see is that in 1990, the difference between the predicted temperature and the measured temperature is quite small. So the IPCC people were confident that they could model change in temperature of our planet. In 2007, the gap is now increased significantly, and yet they are very confident with up to 90% that they are right and that human is causing temperature changes in our planet. The last report dated 2013, the gap between predicted temperature and measured temperature is even greater. Yet, they still continue to say that they are even more sure that humans are responsible for global warming. Climatology, in that respect, is the only science I know in which, as the theoretical background diverges more and more from the measured data, people are more and more confident that their theory is correct. This is amazing. I've never seen that anywhere else in any science whatsoever. People are also telling you that the poles are melting and therefore we have to limit our production of carbon dioxide and that poor polar bears are going to die because of human activity. It turns out, in fact, that this is a lot of advertisement by certain ONG organizations, among them WWF. In 1970, the polar bear population was about 5,000 individuals. They were very low because people hunted them a lot for fun, but laws were passed where people could not hunt polar bear any longer. Since then, the population rose between 30,000 to 35,000 individuals. That means a whopping 7 times increase in the population of polar bears. So these animals are far from being extinct. They are actually increasing in size and enjoying themselves a lot. It is said that scientists who were actually monitoring the health and the amount of polar bears in this region of the Arctic lied in only to satisfy public demand, and we know exactly who the public are, and these are some organizations like WWF and others who need money, and the way to get money is obviously to scare people. The other thing is that people are being told that the Arctic sea ice is disappearing, and they are being showed with this average monthly sea ice extent starting somewhere between 1979 and the very dramatic slope showing you the decrease in sea ice. In fact, if you go back in time and you want to have satellite data, the NASA will tell you that there was no satellite data before 1979. This is not true. This graph comes actually from the NASA itself, and you can see that they monitored sea ice as early as 1970. And you can see that at that time, the amount of ice in the North Pole was actually much lower than the amount of ice we are observing nowadays. It's quite clear that if you start in 1979, the sea ice has simply declined over the years. However, if you start in 1973, for example, it has in fact increased. Clearly, you cannot say that the Arctic has decreased in size depending upon the judicious choice of when you want to start your graph. Arctic sea ice has declined, as Vincher has shown it, but it has declined when we started to leave the little ice age, which is normal because we entered a warmer period. And it's clear that it's slowing down now, and for the past 10 years, more or less, there has been no real loss in sea ice. It's actually been reconstructing itself and probably will increase over the next few years as the temperature will decline again. Now, people will also tell you, climatologists, alarmists will tell you that Greenland is melting away, and this is going to raise sea level at a dramatic level. If you look at, for example, the biggest glacier in Greenland, Zacharias Glacier, you can see that between 2012 and 2015, there has in fact been an increase in the amount of ice of that glacier. You can see that on the curves that are displayed there. But the most interesting point is that Greenland gained 225 gigatons of ice more since 2012 to 2016. If it gains ice, it clearly cannot melt away. There have been periods earlier in the 1930s till 1950s where in fact people have already recorded the melting of Greenland, and in 1940, for example, the Courier Mail in Brisbane claimed that the Greenland was melting so much that we were nearing a catastrophe at that time. Now, what is really sad is not so much that these kind of things happen and have been obviously put under the carpet by alarmist climatologists. What is really sad is how data have been manipulated in order to fulfill their agenda. This is the temperature recorded in Reykjavik. You can see that the temperature went up to the 1940s, down to the 1970s, and up again. After manipulation by NASA, the temperature in the 1940s has significantly been dropped down and increase in the temperature, giving you the feeling of an abnormal temperature increase, surfaces and comes out. This is absolutely disgusting. It is no longer science, it is manipulation. As for the dangerous sea level rise, this is what happened about 20,000 years ago. As we leave the last glacial period, the sea level rose dramatically by about 120 meters. Since then, at the beginning, since we reached the beginning of the Holocene, the sea level has been rising steadily by a few millimeters per year, 1 to 2 millimeters per year. If we have a closer look at this dramatic increase, you can see that from 1850 to about 2012, 2013, the slope of the increase has barely changed. If anything, it has slightly slowed down. In red, you have what people nowadays call the catastrophic sea level rise, compared to the natural sea level rise. This is allegedly due to man-made production of CO2. This is due to nature. I cannot foresee any difference in the slope of these two curves. These data have been measured by satellites, and there too show an increase in sea level which is steady and which is in the order of 1 to 2 millimeters per year as far as we can measure these kind of things. Let me finally remind you that carbon dioxide is in fact good for the planet. It is not a poison. Carbon dioxide is food for plants. And our period nowadays is a period in which plants are starving from CO2. They are starving because the level of CO2 is one of the lowest we have encountered in our planet so far. In fact, there were periods when CO2 levels were nearly 20 times higher as the one we have nowadays. What we can see over the past 30 years as monitored by satellite is that planet Earth is greening tremendously. There have been a measured 20% greening of our planet, out of which about half is due to the presence of carbon dioxide. Plants need CO2, they need slightly higher temperature, and they will grow better, be harder, and be more resistant if they have that. Even deserts are now shrinking for the sheer reason that they release less water, therefore they can survive under harsher climate conditions. This is a graph showing you how the plant can get bigger and in better health if you increase CO2 level from 285 ppm to 435 ppm. In normal greenhouse, people will actually put in there on purpose about 1,200 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and that's the overall amount, the average best amount of CO2 for plant growth. Can we do something? Well, in the best method, the state-of-the-art carbon capture techniques we have nowadays, we can capture about 100 million tons per year. That means if we want to remove 1 ppm, and suppose that we all stop producing CO2 at all, it will take us 24 years to remove 1 ppm. That means 1.2 thousand years to remove 50 ppm if we imagine this completely ludicrous stop in production of CO2. Therefore, we should not spend huge amount of money in this kind of thing. We should use that money for the welfare of human people on this planet, for tackling real pollution problem and not throwing it for things that will never have any impact on our life, if not negative impacts. The worst thing is NASA knew all this from the beginning and they played a bad role in it. This is James Hansen climate model predictions. You can see that one of his predicted behavior, the one where we change nothing, in fact correlates very well with the observed temperatures that we are measuring nowadays. However, among all those scenarios, they chose the one which is the scariest one, the one that will lead to increased worry about the citizen. What we are observing is this and not that. And as the years move on, the gap, the discrepancy increases more and more between reality and models. Even IPCC knew that what they were going to do is impossible. They recognized that they were dealing with climate and that climate contained chaotic components. If they have chaotic components, you cannot predict what it will be with any accuracy. And therefore, they themselves claim that they cannot predict the long-term future climate state. Yet, they will tell you that in 2.1 thousand, we are going to be in a dramatic stage unless we stop generating CO2. That means basically unless we stop using any fossil fuel whatsoever, which signals basically the end of our civilization and the end of the good way of living that we have encountered. I would like to finish by taking a few words from Richard Feynman, a very nice physicist who said that it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, it doesn't matter how sexy it is, it doesn't matter how appealing it is. If it's wrong, if it doesn't correlate with the hard fact, with the hard data, you just throw it away. And this is exactly what we should do with the IPCC and global warming theory. It doesn't fit with the data. Therefore, we should not take care of it. We should just get rid of it and go back to good science, measure things, correlate them with something that's correlable, and understand really climate as scientists should understand. Thank you very much for your attention.